As you know, we've been going through our study on the Antichrist here in Revelation. We've defined who the Antichrist is, and we even have hopped into the book of Daniel looking at the little horn. Now today, we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 13. But to really understand those first few verses that we're going to be covering today, we need to hop back to the book of Daniel to look at chapters 2 and 7 for its background. So stay tuned. This is the Living Logos. Well, we finally made it to chapter 13, so let's kind of kick off and read the first few verses, and then we're going to be hopping back to the book of Daniel to really understand what we're reading. So Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 states the following: "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet like a bear's, and its mouth like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power, and his throne, and great authority." So again, we're talking about the Antichrist here. We see that Satan, who is the dragon, is the one who gives him his throne and his authority. This is the man that has finally taken the offer that was offered to Christ in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 during his temptation on the wilderness. And Daniel is describing what his kingdom is going to be like in the last days. And he describes it in terms of these animals. Now, to really understand what these animals are and who these animals represent, we really need to go back to the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel chapter 7. But I thought it would be good if we wouldn't only look at Daniel 7, but take the opportunity to look at Daniel chapter 2 with it as well. Because there's a lot of times that when we cover this material, we see that there is a need to look at the visions given of Nebuchadnezzar about the kingdoms that would follow him, and then the vision that Daniel was given in chapter 7 about these beasts, which is really what chapter 13 is looking at. So I think it's profitable for us to kind of go back and look at these items. So if we hop back to Daniel chapter 2, if you remember, Daniel has recently come to Babylon. He has been taken captive, and he is in Nebuchadnezzar's court for this. Nebuchadnezzar, he ends up having this dream, and he ends up testing all of his magicians and soothsayers and people that are more esoteric in nature. And he wants them not only to describe the dream to him, but also to tell him what the dream means. And they're stunned. They have no idea how to interpret a dream that they don't even know what the dream is. So long story short, Daniel and his friends, they have a prayer meeting all night, and God reveals to Daniel not only what the dream is, but its interpretation. And that's what chapter 2 is really about. Now, when we look at chapter 2, we're given this statue that is presented to Nebuchadnezzar. And you find that its head is of gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thigh is of bronze, its legs are of iron, and its feet are this iron mixed with clay, and it has 10 toes. At the end of it, we see this giant stone that's made without hands that comes and smashes the feet and destroys the statue, and this rock then comes and fills the entire earth. This rock ultimately represents Jesus Christ and his millennial kingdom that will come and fill the entirety of the earth, destroying the kingdoms of man at his second coming. But one thing to note is that as we go through each of these metals represent a specific kingdom. We know this because when we read Daniel chapter 2, verse 38, Daniel makes it clear. He says to Nebuchadnezzar that you are the head of gold. And the dream given to Nebuchadnezzar is one of the kingdoms that he currently has, and of the kingdoms that will follow his thereafter. And I've already kind of named them. So we have Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then we'll begin discussing the legs of iron for a little bit later in this episode. And then we know that the kingdom that's iron mixed with clay with the 10 toes, that is the Antichrist kingdom itself. Because as we read about the little horn, when it comes to the fourth beast, it has 10 horns. Those 10 horns are 10 kings, and of those 10 horns, a little horn rises up in that. We also see in the book of Revelation, looking at the dragon, that has those 10 horns. We see the beast has 10 horns of itself. So it's the same 10 horns that we encounter through there. But we also know from other verses, other chapters in Daniel, Daniel 8 and 10 specifically, that the chest of silver, chest arm of silver, and the belly and thighs of bronze, that those are the Persian and the Grecian empires. It really tells us so. When we get to chapter 8, we encounter this ram with 2 horns, represent the Medes and the Persians. The angel tells Daniel exactly that this is the Persian Empire. And then the goat with the single horn, as we discussed in Daniel 8, we're also told that that is the Grecian Empire, specifically representing Alexander the Great. And then once that horn was broken, it went in the 4, and he gave it to his generals, to Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And we, in the last episode, or 2 episodes ago, we went into chapter 11, where we begin discussing 2 of those 4 horns that really mattered between the Seleucus and Ptolemy empires, from where Antiochus Epiphanes then came out of the Seleucid Empire, who really is a historical forerunner of the Antichrist himself. And then when we get to Daniel 10, we find that there's a spiritual warfare that's happening to Daniel, as Gabriel is releasing to give him the vision of the 70 weeks. And he says, I was prevented by the prince of Persia, and lo, the prince of Greece comes. So these empires, they are falling in succession, one after the other, from Babylon itself. And there are these angelic beings that are also involved in these coming of these nations as well. Now, so we already know what most of the metals are, but let's kind of touch on here about the 2 legs of iron, because there is a diverging of interpretations that we can go with. One is a more traditional view, and the other is, I would say, maybe a more recent view of how we could look and interpreting what are, in fact, the 2 legs of iron themselves. So let me start off looking at the traditional view, which is also called the Roman view. So typically it goes from Greece, then comes the Roman Empire. And we do know that the Roman Empire did end up splitting between the West and the East. So it looks cleanly at the division of those legs as the splitting of the empire itself, because it was so large. Then the feet that are iron mixed with clay is kind of like a fragmentation of that Roman Empire, and then the 10 toes. So as we go into a more Roman interpretation of these 2 legs, we begin to look at this revived Roman Empire conclusion, which ends up making the Antichrist more European. This is the traditional view. You can find a lot of material about that, and this is the view that I've grown up with myself regarding the 2 legs of iron itself. But I've kind of encountered this other view, and I'm starting to think it makes a lot more sense. When you look at the scripture itself, the Bible is a Middle Eastern setting, because that's where Israel is. It's very Israel-centric. And so when we talk about the geographies of prophecy and of the scripture, it's exactly where Israel is. And so it makes sense as we look at prophecies, it would be the nations that are directly around Israel that should be involved. And in this case, as we look at the Roman Empire, we find that there are limitations with its boundaries. So as we noted, Babylon, then came Persia. Persia ate all of Babylon. Then Greece came along, and they kind of ate all of the Persian Empire. Rome didn't really do that. Rome did increase under its largest extent, I believe, under Trajan in 117 AD. And it had links all the way to the west in Britain, and then to the east. They did make it all the way to Babylon, but Babylon was kind of destroyed at this point, and they didn't really hold those territories very long. In fact, the East was very problematic for the Roman Empire itself. We had the Parthians that came up. They were in Iran. They're the Persians that had kind of resurfaced. They were able to kind of break off the yoke of the Seleucid Empire, which is Greek. And there was a lot of conflict that Rome was having with the Parthians. Then after the Parthians came the Sassanians themselves, and they kind of had a more centralized government, and they're the ones that established Zoroastrianism as the central religion that was over there. And that empire held over in that region until 651 AD when it finally fell. It is the last pre-Islamic empire in that area. Rome never fully conquered the lands of Persia. It barely held going to Babylon itself. So it didn't really venture too far into the east, even if its borders did temporarily expand there. It didn't really house that. But when we look at, a view that holds that the two legs are not Roman, but Islamic, that to me ends up changing the picture. Because as we look at these empires that took over one another, again, Rome not fully taking over where the Persian Empire did, and even to the Grecian Empire, but the Islamic-caliphate really did. It extended its borders into those regions, also into North Africa, and they began, even later on, under the Ottomans, beginning to go into Spain and to Greece, and to really have a lot of territory that they began to eat up themselves. They were very unyielding. When we talk about Daniel 7 and we look at this great iron beast that devoured, and we look at Rome, and Rome certainly was a problem to deal with. They would, crush anyone who came their way. They were very ruthless in that regards, but they were also very peaceful at the same time. Territories that they maintained, they let you worship who they wanted or whoever you wanted, as long as you gave homage to Caesar. So they didn't really impact your culture too much. They let you exist under that Roman law. And then you had this whole Pax Romana that ended up happening in the middle of that as well, which is the Roman peace. This is the time when Christ came in. So Rome is a semi-tolerant empire itself, beyond it's not just meaning the geographies. But when we look at an Islamic view of things, Islam is very intolerant to a lot of the cultures that it encounters. In fact, whenever it comes through, it crushes everything. It crushes buildings. It changes places of worship. It forces people to worship Allah or die. In fact, Islam, it does mean submission. That is in all of that. So it's a very intolerant religion, and it does fit a description of an iron-crushing beast that just completely decimates absolutely everything and engulfs all the territory that it is in. So when we look at how in the world those legs could split, we do know that early on, as Islam started, and we start going through all the caliphs, it wasn't too long after the death of Muhammad that the Islamic religion, it ended up splitting into the Sunnis and the Shias themselves. And possibly, if that is what ends up taking the place of the two legs, then progressing from Babylon to Persia to Greece to an Islamic caliphate instead of, the legs of the Roman Empire, then this could be something that matches that view as well for the two legs of iron. And then it would be from that Islamic caliphate, instead of a revived Roman Empire, we would then have a revived Islamic caliphate, which they are looking to raise back up in the last days. And we can get more into that as we go through the study on the Antichrist, diving more into that Islamic theory of who he might be and where he will come from and how that empire will look. So stay tuned. If we then move on to Daniel 7 now that we've explained Daniel chapter 2 and those succession of kingdoms that come from Nebuchadnezzar's dream that was given to him, of the kingdoms that would come after him, then we get into Daniel 7. And when we get to Daniel 7, we're starting a new portion of the book of Daniel. Daniel can really be put into two halves. You have the first half, which is chapters 1 through 6, and then you have the second half, which is 6 through 12. The book itself isn't necessarily chronological, except for if you look at the facts that chapters 1 through 6 are chronological in their own historical settings. And then chapter 7 through 12, those visions, those prophecies given to Daniel, those are chronological as well as they are given to Daniel. However, you'll find that chapter 6 of Daniel in its historical reference is dealing with Daniel under Persian control, and Daniel 5 is Babylonian control. Chapters 7 and 8 of Daniel are dealing more specifically with him under Belshazzar's reign. So they are in between the 5th and the 6th chapters. So the book's not necessarily chronologically unless you understand those two halves. But when we get into Daniel 7, we get this first vision that is given to Daniel himself. And when it comes to Daniel himself, the first thing he gets is he has this vision of the end times. And we see these animals that we saw here in Revelation 13. We saw this beast that was made up of a leopard, a bear, and a lion that were kind of all amalgamated together. But Daniel saw these beasts separately and distinct. The first one that he sees is this lion that had wings of an eagle, and the eagle's wings were ripped off, and they stood up, and it was given the heart of a man. We see this lopsided bear that's given, and then this leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And then finally, this great iron beast that is just totally destructive about everything that is around it. And when we look at these animals that are described to Daniel in this vision, they usually are seen as an overlap, traditionally speaking, of Daniel chapter 2 that I just explained. So the head of gold was Babylon, the chest and arms of silver are Persia, the belly and thighs of Greece, and then the traditional view would then hold room for the iron legs. They take that interpretation, and typically they'll say, Daniel 2 is how man sees its kingdoms, glorious and eternal and shining with beautiful metals. And Daniel 7 is how God sees those kingdoms as spiritual, savage beasts that are there. So then they map on that the lion is Babylon. There were lions on the Ishtar gate, no winged lions, if I remember correctly, but there were lions on the Ishtar gate, along with dragons. Then they say that the bear represents Persia, and that its lopsidedness, one side was stronger than the other. And then of the leopard, that it represents Greece, 4 heads, as it goes to the 4 generals of Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And then finally, that the iron beast, again, going back to Rome in that traditional interpretation there. And that may or may not be correct. One thing that I do want to note that I do find interesting, because there is a more modern take on how we could look at this, is when we get to Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 through 12, we encounter this word about these beasts. It's an Aramaic word that we translate as before. What's interesting about that is in Daniel 2, we view these kingdoms in succession. So from Babylon to Persia to Greece to the kingdom after that. That is not what Daniel is writing to us in the Aramaic in Daniel chapter 7. He's not talking about a succession that first was the lion, and then the bear, and then the leopard, and then this 4th beast. So it's not before in sequencing. It's rather before as in, you are before me. If I was in the presence of a king, I would be before the king. If I'm in, before President Trump or any other type of leader, I am literally in their presence. That's what this word before means. If that is the case, with that interpretation, then what we see in Daniel 2 is a succession of kingdoms that flow after Babylon, that then is looking at a specific territory that ends up being where the Antichrist kingdom is. Then in Daniel 7, we're looking at the time of the Antichrist kingdom in the last days, because he does have this whole vision of the Son of Man coming and judgment happening. So this is the last days vision. But that in the territory of where the Antichrist kingdom is, these other beasts will be there, and they get amalgamated into this beast kingdom. I mean, we see it. We read it in, Revelation 13 here, where, I'll just read these verses again, starting in verse 1. He says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea." The sea is typically representing people, so out of the peoples, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems and horns and blasphemous names on its head. And here it is. "And the beast that I saw was like a leopard," so going back to Daniel, "its feet like a bear," back to Daniel, "and its mouth like a lion's mouth." So those first 3 beasts that Daniel's seen 7, they are brought into this beast kingdom itself. So I find it to be more plausible then, in not saying that the Daniel 2 kingdoms are the same as the Daniel 7 kingdoms, because the kingdoms around the time of the beast will not be the same kingdoms as in ancient times during Babylon, Persia, and Greece. Now, even if they would be the same, most of those kingdoms themselves today, specifically, looking at Babylon and Persia, those are all ruled by Islam currently, in and of itself as well. But I find it more provoking, if you will, looking at that word before and saying that these beasts, they are going to be kingdoms that will be brought into the Antichrist kingdom itself. Now, maybe your next question then is, well, what are specifically those kingdoms? I have absolutely no idea what those kingdoms are. I would guess from looking at my study and how all this is going and the view that we're going to be taking, that they're probably more Islamic nations that are around. There are others that try to look at it and take a more global look at this as well. For instance, they look at the lion with the eagle's wings. We see, with the English symbol of a lion and a heart, and that the eagle's wings is America, and that gets ripped off because of the separation from Britain to America. And then you have the Russian bear. I have no idea what a leopard would be in that. I don't know if that's true or not. I look at this more like when we read Revelation chapter 13, we see the number 666. It says, those who have understanding, that they shall know and understand it, meaning that the people, the time that thing happens, they're going to be the ones with knowledge and understanding about that. Whenever the Antichrist rises, they're going to know who these kingdoms are that get brought up into this Antichrist territory. That's something that we could perhaps discuss in future episodes itself. But I think what Daniel 7 is giving us is the background information for us to truly understand that these kingdoms, they are before this beast, and he is the one that brings them in to create his own personal kingdom. I guess also with that, if we're only looking at, three other main kingdoms that are kind of being amalgamated into this Antichrist kingdom, that lets us know that he doesn't have global power. And we understand he doesn't have global power because when you read Daniel 11, for instance, as we went through that and we read the back part of that passage, he hears of tidings, or the king of the south will come against them, Egypt. So Egypt is obviously a kingdom he ends up putting down. We looked at those passages of the three horns that he takes down, possibly Egypt and Libya and Sudan, quite possibly. But then on top of that, we hear that he hears tidings from the north and from the east. And that's what causes him to leave and go, and he set up shops in the glorious land that is Israel. And this is setting up the battle of Armageddon. We find that the Euphrates River dries up and the kings of the east march. That possibly could allude to the tidings of the east that he hears in Daniel chapter 11. So whoever the east, China and the rest of these eastern nations, they may be marching against the Antichrist, and he is preparing to battle against him. So he obviously doesn't have total worldwide dominance of his kingdom, but he will have a particular reign of power, I believe, that will be around the Middle East itself. We see that Antiochus Epiphanes, he came from the Seleucid Empire, which is Syria, looking at the territory and geography of Turkey today. So I think this is going to be a more Middle Eastern centric empire, which also takes me to looking at a more Islamic view rather than a European view. And on top of that, we just find that typically in biblical prophecy, we're dealing with the nations that are around Israel itself. When you get into the Battle of Gog and all that, these are all Middle Eastern nations. So I don't really like taking a view of looking at more of a European-centric thing. It's kind of adjacent territories, if you will. So now that we've covered that part of it, looking at the beast and his kind of kingdoms, kind of giving you an idea of the Daniel 2 and the Daniel 7 interpretation there. In the next episode, we're going to be looking more specifically at the possible origins of the Antichrist himself, looking at specific passages where it begins discussing his possible heritage that is there. So we'll get into all of that. Hope this has been helpful. Share this with a friend, talk about it, discuss it. If you have any questions, please reach out to questions@thelivinglogos.net. Until next time, unless Jesus returns. God bless.